Fog hangs low over Scotia before dawn. The mill whistle has been silent for years, but the town still looks arranged, as if someone set every house down with a ruler. Wet blacktop, trim porches, a crosswalk painted in the middle of nowhere, leading from one side of an empty road to the other. A river moving brown and slow under the bridge, carrying something it picked up in the hills. And mounted near the road, a rusting saw blade displayed like a coat of arms, a monument to something that once fed everyone here, that once organized their whole lives into shifts and schedules and rent receipts. Just beyond that neat grid of homes, the hills rise in silence, the same hills that once held some of the last ancient redwood forests in private hands anywhere on earth. For generations, people were told this place was stable, that it was decent, that it was different. A company town, yes, but a good one. A timber empire, yes, but a careful one. A business built on cutting trees that had somehow convinced itself, and the people living inside it, that it understood the difference between use and destruction. Then Wall Street arrived, and what it found, underneath all that order, all that tradition, all that fog, was not a community, not a legacy, not a covenant. It was collateral with curtains. So what destroyed Pacific Lumber Company in the end? An outside predator that descended on something innocent? Or the exposed nature of an empire that had always owned too much, cut too much, and trusted that no one would ever come to collect? This is the story of a forest, a town, a debt, and the slow disassembly of a kingdom most Americans never knew existed until it was almost gone. Chapter 1. The Town That Belonged to the Company. If you drove into Scotia, California in the 1980s, you might have thought you had taken a wrong turn into another era. The streets were clean, the lawns were level, the houses were painted in company colors, cream and brown, and they were owned, to the last one, by Pacific Lumber Company. Not a property management firm, not a housing trust. The company, your employer, your landlord, the entity that also ran the general store, the recreation center, and the community hall. In 1986, Scotia was identified as the only company town in California still formally licensed by the state. One company, one town, no separation. You paid rent to the company, you cashed your check from the company, you bought groceries in a building the company owned. Your children played in a park the company maintained. If something broke in your house, you called the company. The company came. This was not a slum. That is the first thing to understand and the most important thing. Scotia was, by nearly every physical measure, a good place to live. The houses were solid, the rents were low, far below market rate for the region. The streets were lit and kept. There were organized sports leagues, a motel, a museum, a barber shop. Men who had worked the mill for 30 years still had their same address. Their fathers had sometimes had that address before them. A man named John Maurer, who had spent his working life in the mill, said it plainly. He said, "You knew you'd retire from there." That sentence does a lot of work if you hold it long enough. It contains security. It contains loyalty. It contains a depth of trust that most people in most jobs never feel. And underneath all of that, if you listen close enough, it contains something a little like surrender, a surrender to the idea that your whole life could be safely organized by one entity, that the entity would never change its mind, that the contract would hold. The town was designed so that life inside it worked, so that you did not need to go very far for very much. You worked, you came home, you stayed. The forest began where the last row of houses ended, and that was the direction nothing came from and nothing left toward. The forest was the background, the company was the foreground, and for a very long time that arrangement felt permanent. That feeling of permanence, of arrangement, of a life set down with a ruler is the first thing you need to carry into everything that follows, because every violation the story delivers will land harder for it. Chapter 2. The Benevolent Empire. Pacific Lumber Company was not built on recklessness. That is the inconvenient heart of this story, and you cannot understand what happened without sitting with it for a while. The company was founded in 1863 in Humboldt County, in the coastal redwood belt of Northern California. It began as a sawmill operation in a landscape that must have looked, to anyone standing in it at the time, like an inexhaustible vault. Trees 2,000 years old, trees 30 feet across at the base, trees so tall they caught the fog before it reached the ground, and around those trees, eventually, a town. By the middle of the 20th century, Pacific Lumber had settled into something unusual in American industry, a long-duration family stewardship model associated most closely with the Murphy family, who ran the company through much of the 1900s. Under the Murphys, the approach was called selective cutting. You did not clear a hillside. You moved through it, took some trees, left others, let the forest continue. You managed the land as if you were going to be there in 50 years because you expected to be. The harvest levels reflected this. Where a more aggressive operation would have pushed extraction as high as markets would bear, Pacific Lumber kept its yield deliberately moderate, calibrated to what the land could sustain across decades. Warren Murphy, one of the men who embodied this era, would later say simply, "We were the good guys." It is the kind of thing that sounds self-serving until you look at the record and realize it was at least partly true. The forest was not being liquidated, the jobs were stable, the town was maintained. The benefits extended well beyond steady employment. Workers received competitive wages for the region. Rents in Scotia were kept below market rate. The company offered scholarships. It maintained recreational facilities, health coverage, long-term security. These were not luxuries handed down from some sense of charity. They were structural features of a paternalistic system that required workers to trust the company in exchange for the company's protection. It was, in short, a deal. And like all deals, it depended entirely on who held the other end of it. The Murphys held it. And for as long as the Murphys held it, the deal was honored. The forest stayed mostly intact. The town stayed mostly whole. The books stayed mostly clean. And year after year, in the quiet of Humboldt County, Pacific Lumber generated modest, consistent profit while sitting atop one of the most extraordinary privately held natural assets in the continental United States, hundreds of thousands of acres of timberland, including stands of ancient old-growth redwood that had been growing since before the Norman conquest. This is where the story turns, because the very qualities that made Pacific Lumber honorable were the same qualities that made it vulnerable. The restraint, the long horizon, the reluctance to push extraction to its limit. These choices kept the trees standing and the employees loyal, and they also kept the share price low. They kept the balance sheet debt-free. They kept the company looking, to a certain kind of outside eye, like an institution sitting on a mountain of value it had never bothered to unlock. That kind of gap between what a company is worth on paper and what it generates in returns is not just an accounting anomaly. In the financial world of the 1980s, it was an invitation. Chapter 3. Why a good company became prey. There is a cruel theorem at the heart of American corporate finance, and Pacific Lumber ran directly into it. The theorem works like this. If a company manages its assets conservatively, prioritizes long-term sustainability over short-term returns, and carries no debt, Then its stock price will reflect a modest earnings stream rather than the full value of what it owns. The company looks cheap, not because it is failing, but because it is patient. And in the 1980s, patience was not a virtue the market rewarded. It was a gap waiting to be arbitraged. Pacific Lumber's land was worth far more than its share price suggested. The company owned ancient timber that had taken centuries to grow, timber that, if cut and sold aggressively rather than harvested selectively, would generate cash at a rate the existing management had deliberately chosen not to pursue. From the outside, from the vantage of someone scanning balance sheets in Houston or Manhattan, this looked like waste. It looked like a company too sentimental about trees to realize what those trees were actually worth in board feet, in dollars, in debt service. The company had no meaningful long-term debt. That was not an accident. The Murphys had kept it that way. A debt-free company with hundreds of thousands of acres of prime redwood timberland, a functioning company town, several mill operations, and a suppressed share price. You did not need to be a financial genius to see the opportunity. You needed only to be willing to do what the Murphys were not willing to do. The people inside Pacific Lumber knew the company was undervalued. What they did not anticipate, what almost no one in Scotia anticipated, was that the very features of the company that made it worth loving also made it worth taking. The conservation ethos had suppressed the extraction rate. The paternalism had suppressed the cost-cutting impulse. The family control had suppressed the shareholder pressure to perform. All of those suppressions, stacked together, had created exactly the profile that corporate raiders in the 1980s were trained to find, a company sitting on wealth it refused to convert. There was a phrase circulating in financial circles during that era, the idea of an asset that was being managed for the benefit of its stewards rather than its shareholders. The diagnosis was framed as a failure of corporate governance. The solution was to change who held the power. The mechanism was a hostile takeover. And the instrument, the financial tool that made such takeovers possible, even for buyers who did not have the cash to pay for what they wanted, was the leveraged buyout, financed by high-yield debt that became known, not affectionately, as junk bonds. Founded in 1863, running for over 120 years without a serious external threat, debt-free, profitable, conservative, admired. The company had 122 years to build what it built, and it was vulnerable to losing it in less than a year. Because the same forest that had taken 2,000 years to grow, the same town that had taken 3 generations to feel like permanence, all of it was sitting on a public stock exchange, priced in shares anyone could buy. And somewhere in the early 1980s, a man in Texas began to notice the price. The harvest numbers at the time of the takeover stood at 175.7 million board feet per year. The timberlands covered more than 200,000 acres. The share price implied a company worth less than what its forest alone could generate if the patience were simply removed. You did not need to love redwoods to see the logic. You only needed to stop loving them. Chapter 4. The Thing Hidden in the Hills. To understand what Pacific Lumber really owned, you have to leave the town. You have to walk past the last row of cream and brown houses, past the equipment sheds and the mill yard, and start moving uphill. The road narrows. The canopy closes. The light changes. It goes from flat coastal gray to something filtered and green and ancient, the kind of light that makes you feel you have entered a place that does not operate on the same schedule as the world you came from. These were redwood forests, not the managed second growth stands that cover most of the Northern California timber belt, not the replanted rows you see from the highway, the even-aged trees that went in after the last clear cut. These were the originals, trees that had been growing before the first Spanish missionaries reached Alta California, trees that were already old when the Magna Carta was signed. Some of them had been standing since the Roman Empire was a going concern, and they were still standing, still adding rings, still pulling fog from the air and turning it into wood. The coastal redwood, Sequoia sempervirens, is the tallest living organism on Earth. A mature specimen can stand over 300 feet and measure more than 20 feet across the base. The bark alone can be a foot thick. The wood is naturally resistant to fire, rot, and insects, which is why old-growth redwood was so valued by the timber industry to begin with. It was extraordinarily durable, extraordinarily beautiful, and for most of the 20th century, extraordinarily available, because almost no one had thought to protect it. By the time Pacific lumber came under scrutiny in the 1980s, roughly 95% of the original old-growth coastal redwood forest had already been cut. What remained was scattered across a few state and national parks, land that had been set aside, saved, protected at public expense. And then, still privately held, still owned by a timber company that had so far chosen not to liquidate it, there was Headwaters. Headwaters Forest was located in the hills above Fortuna, in southern Humboldt County, tucked inside the larger Pacific lumber holdings. It was one of the largest remaining privately owned stands of ancient redwood in the world. Thousands of acres of trees that were hundreds, and in some cases thousands of years old. Habitat for the marbled murrelet, a seabird that nests only in old-growth forests and whose decline was already being tracked by biologists. Habitat for coho salmon in the cold, clear creeks that ran through the groves and out to the Pacific. A watershed, an ecosystem, a living system that had been doing its work without interruption since before human beings arrived on this continent. It was also, on the books of Pacific Lumber Company, a timber inventory. That is the sentence that will not let you go once you understand it. Headwaters was classified as an asset. It appeared on a balance sheet. It had a board-foot value. It could, in theory, be converted into cash. The old management had chosen not to convert it, had in fact built its identity around the decision not to convert it. But a choice is only as permanent as the chooser, and the chooser was about to change. The full Palco holdings at the time covered more than 200,000 acres. Of that, a meaningful portion was old growth, ancient trees that the market would value very differently depending on whether you were a steward counting years or a financier counting payments. Headwaters alone, the crown of the crown, sat at the center of what would become the most expensive and most contested private forest purchase in American history. No one living in Scotia in 1984 knew any of that yet. They knew the forest was there. They had always known it was there. It was the backdrop, the given, the thing that had been there before the town and would, they assumed, be there after. That assumption was the last thing the old world had left, and it was running out of time. Chapter 5. Texas arrives. Charles Hurwitz was not a logger. He was not a forester, not a mill operator, not a man who had grown up around sawdust and timber cruises and the particular culture of a Northern California company town. He was a financier based in Houston, Texas, who ran a company called Maxim Incorporated. And in the mid-1980s, he was very good at a specific and legally contested kind of financial maneuver, finding undervalued companies, acquiring them with borrowed money, and then reorganizing their assets aggressively enough to pay back the debt while extracting a profit. To do this, Hurwitz needed a particular kind of target. Not a failing company. Those had problems of their own. He needed a company that was healthy, cash-generating, and sitting on assets that its existing management was unwilling or unable to monetize at full speed. A company, in other words, exactly like Pacific Lumber. The mechanism for the takeover was the leveraged buyout, a structure in which the buyer uses very little of their own money and borrows the rest, often secured against the assets of the company being acquired. The debt, once the deal closes, belongs not to the buyer, but to the acquired company itself. The company is then responsible for making the interest payments. And the only way a timber company can make large interest payments quickly is to cut more trees. The financing for the Maxim acquisition of Pacific Lumber ran to roughly $900 million in total consideration. The structure included approximately $300 million in bank loans and approximately $450 million in high-yield bonds. The junk bonds that Michael Milken and Drexel Burnham Lambert had made into the defining financial instrument of the decade. The junk bond market was, at its peak, a machine for converting future corporate cash flows into present acquisition capital. It allowed buyers to reach for assets far beyond what their own balance sheets could support. It was enormously profitable. It was also, in many cases, a structure that transferred enormous risk onto the acquired company and everyone inside it. Hurwitz was not the only corporate raider operating in this period. He was not even the most famous, but he may have been the most consequential for the specific geography and ecology of Northern California, because the company he chose to target happened to sit on the last major privately held ancient redwood forest on the continent. Whether he knew the ecological significance of what he was buying is a question without a clean answer. What is clear is that he understood the financial significance. The trees were worth far more dead, cut, milled, sold, converted to cash than they were worth alive and standing, which is how the existing management had been valuing them for decades. This is not unique to Hurwitz. It is the structural logic of leveraged acquisition applied to a natural asset. You borrow to buy. The debt lands on the company. The company needs cash. The cash comes from the land. The faster you move, the faster the debt shrinks. Sentiment is a luxury you cannot afford when an interest payment is due. Hurwitz would later become known for a line he delivered at a meeting with Pacific Lumber employees after the deal closed. He said, "He who has the gold rules." It became the sentence everyone quoted, the sentence that stood in for a whole philosophy. But it is worth remembering that the sentence did not create the situation. The situation created the sentence. Hurwitz was not inventing a new ethic. He was stating plainly an ethic that already governed the world the deal had been made in. He was just willing to say it out loud in a room full of loggers who had thought they were living inside a different story. The acquisition was completed in the last weeks of 1985 and early 1986. The deal price valued Pacific Lumber at roughly $40 per share, a significant premium over where the stock had been trading. Shareholders who tendered made money. The company that remained, the mills, the town, the forest, the workers, the ancient trees, owed nearly $900 million to people it had never met. One of the oldest, most solvent, most conservation-minded timber companies in the American West had become, almost overnight, one of the most indebted. And the hills above Scotia were full of trees. Chapter 6. The Day the Future Changed Hands. The workers found out the way people usually find out about things that have already been decided. Not in a meeting called for their benefit, not in a letter addressed to them. Through rumor first, then official announcement, then the slow dawning understanding that the thing that had been decided was not going to be undecided, no matter how they felt about it. The takeover bid came in the fall of 1985. It was hostile, meaning Pacific Lumber's existing management did not invite it and did not want it. The Murphy family and the old board resisted. They explored alternatives. They looked for a white knight, a friendlier buyer who might outbid Maxim while preserving the existing culture. No white knight appeared. The share price was what it was, and the premium Maxim was offering was real money to the shareholders who held the stock. In the end, the shareholders approved it. That is how the system works. The people who own the shares decide. The people who live in the town and work in the mill and have organized their lives around the assumption of continuity, they are not consulted. Their interests, legally speaking, are not the interests the board is required to protect. The response inside Scotia and among the workforce was not passive. Workers circulated a petition against the takeover. Someone hanged Charles Hurwitz in effigy. There were public expressions of protest, of fear, of grief. People who had spent their adult lives inside this institution understood, at some level, that what was happening was not a management change. It was a regime change. The relationship between the company and the people it employed was being fundamentally renegotiated, and not by anyone who had ever stood on a mill floor or eaten lunch in that town. The disbelief was real and earned. These were people who had been told, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that they were part of something different, that the company's commitment to them was reciprocal, that the paternalism ran both ways. John Maurer had said it, "You knew you'd retire from there." And now there was a man from Texas saying he who has the gold, rules, and the two sentences could not coexist in the same world. What happened in those first weeks and months after the deal closed was a kind of social rupture that is hard to describe in purely economic terms. It was not just that the ownership had changed, it was that the story had changed. The story that the company had always told about stewardship, about community, about the long horizon, was revealed in a single transaction to have been contingent. It had been true only so long as the people who believed in it held the power to act on it. The moment the shares changed hands, the story was over. New management arrived, and new language arrived with it. Words like efficiency, productivity, asset utilization. The easy informality of the old regime, the handshakes and the assumed continuity, gave way to something more formal and more guarded. Workers who had never thought about the financial structure of the company they worked for were suddenly thinking about it constantly, because suddenly it was the most important thing in the world. Some people tried to be optimistic. Change was not necessarily bad. New management sometimes brought new investment, new equipment, new ideas. Maybe this would be different. But there was one number that would not let optimism rest. The company had just taken on nearly $900 million in debt to acquire itself, and the only thing the company owned that could service that debt at the rate it would need to be serviced was the forest. The chainsaw, in other words, was no longer just a tool. It was a financial instrument, and it was about to start working harder than it ever had in the company's history. Chapter 7. He Who Has the Gold Rules. Charles Hurwitz stood in front of an auditorium full of Pacific Lumber employees sometime after the deal closed and offered them a framework for their new reality. He said, "He who has the gold rules." The room absorbed it. Some people were offended. Some were frightened. Some perhaps found it clarifying. At least now they knew where they stood. At least the new owner was not pretending. The pension fund was the first flashpoint. Pacific Lumber had maintained an overfunded pension, meaning the fund held more money than it needed to cover its existing obligations. Under the old management, that cushion sat there as a conservative buffer, the kind of reserve a company keeps when it expects to be responsible for its retirees indefinitely. Under new management, the overfunded portion was a pool of capital sitting idle. Maxim replaced the traditional defined benefit pension with annuities purchased from an insurance company called Executive Life. Workers received assurances that their benefits were protected. What they were not told in plain terms was that Executive Life was itself deeply invested in the junk bond market, the same market that had financed the takeover in the first place. Executive Life would later collapse. The pension saga would not be resolved for years, and it would become one of the most bitterly contested elements of the entire Maxim era. This is the chapter where the new management language and the new institutional reality started to occupy the same space. Asset sales, reorganization, productivity targets, the vocabulary of extraction applied to an institution that had never used it. The tone of Scotia changed. People did not all describe it the same way, but there was a consistent thread, the sense that something invisible but load-bearing had been removed, and everyone was waiting to see what would fall. The mills kept running. The jobs were still there, for now. In some ways, the early years looked continuous with what had come before. You got up, you went to the mill, you cut timber, you came home. The whistle still blew. The town still stood. But underneath the surface of ordinary working life, the financial architecture had been completely replaced. Every board foot of lumber that came out of those hills was now doing double duty, generating revenue and paying down debt. The forest was not just being harvested, it was being serviced. The numbers that accumulated across these first years tell the story more honestly than any single event. The company was founded in 1863 and ran debt-free for over a century. The takeover valued Pacific Lumber at roughly $40 a share, totaling nearly $900 million. The acquisition was financed with approximately $300 million in bank debt and $450 million in junk bonds. Before the takeover, the annual timber harvest stood at 175.7 million board feet. By 1986, that figure had nearly doubled, reaching 326.3 million board feet. By 1988, it climbed again to 368.9 million. And in 1986 alone, because earlier regulatory approvals could be carried forward and stacked, the company's allowable cut reached 17,000 acres in a single year. That is not a company managing a forest. That is a company liquidating one. And yet, from inside the machine, the logic was not hard to follow. The debt existed. The debt had interest. The interest had a due date. The forest was the only asset large enough to service what had been promised to the bondholders. Nobody in this structure had the option of simply deciding to cut less and pay the consequences. The consequences were already built into the contract. They had been built in on the day the deal was signed. He who has the gold rules. The sentence was offensive. It was also accurate. And the gold in question was not in a vault somewhere. It was standing in the hills, in groves that had been growing since before the printing press. The question was not whether those trees would be cut. The question was how many, how fast, and what would be left when the debt was paid. Nobody in 1986 had a good answer, but the chainsaws were already running. Chapter 8. The forest becomes debt service. There is a moment in the story of Pacific Lumber when the abstract becomes concrete, when the financial architecture stops being a background fact and becomes the thing that governs every decision, every shift, every hillside, every tree. That moment is not the day the deal was signed. It is the day someone in a mill town in Humboldt County looked up at the hills and understood that the pace of cutting had changed, not because demand had spiked, not because technology had improved, not because the forest was ready for a heavier harvest, but because a debt clock was running somewhere in Houston, and the only way to keep up with it was to cut more wood. Congressman Ron Wyden, who was watching the situation from Washington, said it plainly. He said the company is cutting trees at a furious pace to help pay for its own takeover. That sentence, the company cutting trees to pay for its own acquisition, is the conceptual center of this entire story. Read it again slowly. The trees that grew for 1,000 years on land the company has owned since 1863 are being converted into cash to pay the people who lent money to the man who just bought the company that owns the trees. The forest is not being harvested. The forest is being billed. The harvest figures do not lie. Before the takeover, Pacific Lumber was cutting 175.7 million board feet per year, a level the Murphys had calibrated to what the land could sustain. In 1986, the first full year under Maxim control, that figure jumped to 326.3 million board feet. In 1988, it rose again to 368.9 million. That is more than double the pre-takeover rate within 2 years. And the allowable cut in 1986 alone, because the regulatory system permitted carried-over approvals to be stacked and deployed, reached 17,000 acres in a single calendar year. At the same time, Maxam expanded the physical footprint of the operation. The Carlotta Mill was purchased, adding processing capacity to match the accelerated harvest. More trees could be cut, more trees could be milled, more payments could be made. The system was being optimized not for the long-term yield of the forest, but for the short-term cash flow of the debt structure. These are not the same thing. They are, in fact, almost exactly opposite things. To understand what that difference looks like on a hillside, you have to understand what selective cutting meant under the old regime versus what accelerated harvest meant under the new one. Selective cutting left the forest largely intact. You moved through it, took what you needed, let the canopy close again. The soil held, the water table held, the streams stayed clear, the animals stayed. The next generation of trees had a chance to grow into the spaces left by the ones you took. The system was slow by design, because the system was meant to last. Accelerated harvest did not work this way. When you push extraction hard, when the financial pressure requires not a careful walk through the forest, but a rapid and comprehensive conversion of standing timber into dollars, the land responds. The soil, once covered by ancient forest canopy and root systems, is exposed to rain. The slopes, which the root networks had been binding together for centuries, begin to move. Sediment enters the creeks. The creeks run murky. The salmon that depend on cold, clear water find something else instead. This is not speculation. It is what happened. The Elk River, which ran through the Palco timberlands in southern Humboldt County, would later be listed as sediment-impaired. Flooding complaints from downstream residents would accumulate through the late 1990s. Watershed discharge rules would eventually be imposed. The biological consequences of the financial decision were not felt immediately. They rarely are, but they were being written into the hillsides with every load of timber that rolled down to the mill. Meanwhile, in the forests above all of this, the old growth still stood. Headwaters still stood. The most ancient, most irreplaceable portion of the entire Pacific lumber estate had not yet been touched. It was still on the books as inventory. And as the debt service continued and the second growth timber was worked through, the question of what to do with the old growth was becoming less and less theoretical. The forest was not just scenery anymore. It was the last large payment waiting to be made. And there were people in the woods who were not going to let that happen without a fight. Chapter 9. The town learns the new rules. The people who cut the trees were not the enemy of the trees. That is the thing that gets lost when this story is told as a simple contest between loggers and environmentalists, between extraction and conservation, between the town and the forest. The men and women who worked the mills and the hillsides of Humboldt County were not abstractions. They were people who had grown up here, whose fathers had worked here, who had built their lives on the assumption that this particular piece of ground would continue to need them. They were not wrong to want that. They were not villains for wanting it, and yet they were the ones holding the chainsaws. The early years under Maxam produced something complex and uncomfortable inside the Scotia workforce. The overtime was real. When you push harvest rates to double what they were before, you need more labor hours, and those hours pay. Some workers, especially younger ones without the long institutional memory, found themselves doing well financially in the first years after the takeover. The checks were good. The equipment was being upgraded. There was a sense, in some quarters, that the old management had been overly cautious, that the forest could sustain more, that the doomsaying was alarmist. But other workers, older ones, workers with longer memories, workers who had watched the Murphys manage the land across decades, were frightened. Not in an abstract political way, in a practical biological way. They had walked those hillsides. They knew what the forest looked like when it was being pushed too hard. They had seen slopes that had been cut too fast begin to slide. They had watched creeks that had run clear their whole lives start to run brown. The math of the situation was not invisible to people who spent their days inside it. And there was something else. The paternalism that had sometimes felt confining under the old regime, the company that owned your house, organized your recreation, employed your father, had also been real protection. It had meant something that the company was going to be here forever, that it had a long-term interest in the land and in the people on it. Under the new regime, the long-term interest had been replaced by a debt schedule. The company was not going to be here forever. It was going to be here until the debt was paid or the company broke, whichever came first. And everyone in Scotia, at some level, was beginning to understand that. This is the real tragedy that gets buried in the larger political narrative. The workers of Pacific Lumber were caught between two forces that neither of them had chosen and neither of them fully controlled. On one side, the financial logic of the takeover demanded accelerated cutting. On the other side, the environmental movement that was gathering in the forests outside town was increasingly insisting that the cutting stop. The workers were the people in the middle, the people whose livelihoods were the lever being pulled in both directions. Some resented the environmentalists. They were outsiders, mostly. They did not live in Scotia. They did not have children in the local school. They did not know what it was like to wake up every morning and wonder whether the industry that had defined your family's life for 3 generations was going to survive the decade. When protesters from San Francisco and Berkeley showed up on logging roads, the friction was not simply ideological. It was the friction of people who felt their lives were being used as props in someone else's morality play. That resentment was understandable. It was also, in some ways, exactly what the new management needed. As long as the conflict was framed as loggers versus environmentalists, the actual financial architecture, the junk bonds, the debt load, the accelerated harvest schedule that had been imposed from Houston, stayed invisible. The workers and the protesters were fighting each other, while the people who had designed the situation watched from a comfortable distance. Some workers understood this. Some tried to say it. They were not always heard, and outside the town, In the dark of the forest, people were beginning to show up with signs, with tents, and eventually with their bodies, placing themselves between the chainsaws and the oldest trees on the continent. Chapter 10. Headwaters. There are places on Earth that do not feel like ordinary landscape, places where the scale of living things overwhelms the human scale so completely that the usual categories, property, inventory, asset, acreage, begin to feel not just insufficient, but actively absurd. Headwaters Forest was one of those places. To walk into Headwaters was to enter a cathedral that had not been built. No one had designed the arches of those canopies. No one had carved the buttresses of those root systems. No architect had calculated the span of those crowns or arranged the light through that particular density of needles. It had arrived at its own design over centuries, through competition and death and regrowth, and the slow accumulation of biological complexity so deep that scientists who studied it still did not fully understand the relationships between its parts. The trees were only the most visible element. Beneath them was a world of fungi and soil organisms and invertebrates and mosses, all interlocked, all dependent, all ancient. The marbled murrelet nested there. The murrelet is a seabird. It spends most of its life on the ocean, diving for fish, living at sea. But it nests inland in old-growth forests because it requires the wide, moss-covered branches of ancient trees to lay its eggs. No old-growth forest, no nesting, no recovery. By the 1980s, the murrelet was already declining sharply across its range because the old-growth forest was gone from most of its historic territory. What remained in places like Headwaters was not just beautiful, it was functionally irreplaceable. The coho salmon used the creeks that ran through Headwaters. Cold, shaded, sediment-free water, the conditions that old-growth canopy creates and maintains. The salmon were also declining. They had been declining for decades as logging had warmed streams, filled spawning beds with silt, and removed the large woody debris that salmon require for habitat. The connection between the trees and the fish was not metaphorical. It was biological and direct. The trees shaded the water and kept it cold. The trees fell into the water and created structure. The trees held the soil on the slopes and kept the creeks clear. Remove the trees, and you do not simply remove the trees. You begin a cascade of consequences that moves through the watershed like a slow fire. This is what made Headwaters different from an ordinary timber inventory. It was not just a stand of large, valuable trees, it was a system. A functioning, integrated, irreplaceable ecological system, one of the last of its kind on privately held land anywhere in the world. The state parks had saved some of it, the national parks had saved some of it, but Headwaters had never been in public hands. It had always been part of the Pacific Lumber Estate, and the Pacific Lumber Estate had, under the Murphys, chosen to leave it alone. Under Maxim, that choice was no longer guaranteed. The Grove sat within the larger Palco holdings, more than 200,000 acres of timberland in total, with the Headwaters complex nested inside it like a jewel inside a box. When regulators and activists began to map what was at risk, what they were looking at was not just a few spectacular trees. They were looking at thousands of acres of intact ancient forest, thousands more acres of connecting habitat, and a watershed system that fed some of the most productive salmon streams in Northern California. And they were looking at a company that needed cash. The confrontation between those two facts, the ecological value of the forest and the financial pressure on the company that owned it, became the defining conflict of the next decade. It would involve protesters and politicians, biologists and bondholders, state agencies and federal agencies, loggers, and lawyers. It would produce some of the most dramatic environmental protests in American history. It would cost the public nearly $500 million to resolve in part. And it would leave a set of questions that were never fully answered. Was Headwaters saved? In the narrowest sense, yes. The core groves were eventually protected. The ancient trees are still standing. But the question of what it cost to save them, who paid, who benefited, and what was left unprotected, is a harder question. And that question begins with understanding what it felt like to stand in those groves in the late 1980s, knowing what was coming, and deciding you were going to do something about it regardless of what that cost you. Chapter 11. Protest becomes counter-history. Greg King was a young journalist and environmental activist in Northern California when he first hiked into the Headwaters groves in the mid-1980s. What he found there, the scale of the trees, the depth of the silence, the feeling of stepping into a biological world that most of the continent had lost a century ago, became, for him, something close to a calling. He began documenting what he saw. He began telling people about it, and he became one of the first voices insisting publicly that Headwaters was not just a forest, it was a cause. The organization he worked with, and the broader movement that gathered around the Headwaters issue, came primarily out of Earth First, a radical environmental group founded in the early 1980s on the principle that conventional environmental lobbying was too slow, too compromised, and too deferential to corporate interests to stop the destruction that was underway. Earth First did not wait for regulatory processes. It put bodies in the way. It chained people to trees. It drove metal spikes into trunks to disable chainsaws, a tactic called tree spiking that was genuinely dangerous and deeply divisive, including within the environmental movement itself, but that communicated unmistakably that some people were prepared to raise the cost of cutting beyond what any normal business calculation could absorb. The conflict over Headwaters and the Pacific lumberlands became the site of the most sustained and nationally visible environmental protest campaign in California since the battles over the original Redwood parks decades earlier. Demonstrations at the company's gates began in 1986. They grew. They escalated. By 1990, what organizers called Redwood Summer had drawn thousands of protesters to Humboldt County, a deliberate echo of the Freedom Summer civil rights campaigns of the 1960s, using the same logic of mass nonviolent presence to force a political confrontation onto a national stage. The movement was not clean. Movements rarely are when the stakes are high enough and the frustration is deep enough. There were genuine disagreements within the activist community about tactics, about risk, about what kinds of action were justified and what kinds were counterproductive. Judy Bari, one of the most important organizers of Redwood Summer, was herself a complicated figure. A labor organizer as well as an environmentalist, someone who tried seriously to build coalitions between workers and protesters, to argue that the real enemy of both groups was the financial structure imposed by Maxam and not each other. In 1990, she was nearly killed when a bomb exploded under the seat of her car. The FBI initially accused her of transporting the device herself. She maintained until her death that she had been targeted precisely because she was effective. The case was never solved. The protests polarized the region in ways that took years to begin to heal. In Humboldt County, where the timber industry was the dominant economic force, the arrival of large numbers of outside activists was not universally welcomed, not even by people who privately shared some of their concerns. The protesters sometimes came with a certainty about what needed to happen that did not always account for what it would mean for the workers and families whose livelihoods were directly at stake. That certainty was received sometimes as contempt. And the contempt, real or perceived, made it easier for the company to frame the conflict as outsiders against locals rather than what it actually was. A confrontation between the financial logic of a leveraged acquisition and the biological logic of an irreplaceable ecosystem. But whatever the internal contradictions of the movement, and there were many, the protests accomplished something that lobbying alone could never have achieved. They made the story visible at a national level. They forced politicians, journalists, and ordinary Americans to confront the fact that one of the largest remaining ancient redwood forests in private hands was being threatened by the debt service of a junk bond-financed takeover. That is not an easy sentence to put on a protest sign, but it is the sentence that, once people understood it, made the whole situation feel not just sad, but wrong. The protests ran from 1986 all the way through 1999, more than a decade of sustained confrontation, legal action, regulatory battle, and physical resistance. Thousands of people participated. Hundreds were arrested. The story stayed alive in the national press in a way that purely bureaucratic conservation fights almost never do. And that visibility, that sustained public attention, was what eventually made a negotiated solution possible, not because the company wanted a solution, but because the political cost of not having one became too high to ignore. The activists did not save Headwaters by themselves, but without them, there would have been nothing left to save. And even as the protests continued, the conflict was about to turn darker, more physical, and more lethal than anyone had imagined it would. Chapter 12. Bodies in the Woods. By the late 1990s, the conflict had moved past petitions and protest marches and congressional hearings into something rawer and more physical. The forest had become a contested space in the most literal sense, a place where the question of who had the right to be there and what they had the right to do was being answered not by courts or agencies, but by human bodies and the choices they made with them. The pepper spray incident became a symbol. In 1997, Humboldt County Sheriff's deputies were filmed swabbing concentrated pepper spray directly onto the eyes of protesters who had chained themselves to furniture inside a congressional office and inside the Pacific Lumber offices in Carlotta. The protesters were practicing nonviolent civil disobedience. The method of removal, direct application of a caustic chemical to the eyes of restrained people, shocked many who saw the footage and became national news. Lawsuits followed. The incident said something about how far the situation had escalated, about how much the people on both sides of this conflict had come to see the other side as something that needed to be neutralized rather than heard. Then, in September of 1998, a 24-year-old activist named David Chain was killed in the woods above Grizzoli Creek on Pacific Lumberland. He was part of a small group that had gone into a logging area to confront a feller operator, a man running a chainsaw on a hillside. The operator, by some accounts, knew the protesters were in the area. A tree fell. David Chain was struck. He died in the forest, miles from a road, and it took hours to bring his body out. The death drew national attention and sharpened the debate over whether the conflict in Humboldt County had passed the point at which normal political and legal processes could manage it. A criminal investigation was opened. No charges were ultimately filed. The operator said he did not know anyone was in the path of the tree. Witnesses disagreed. The family grieved. The company issued a statement. The forest kept being cut, and high above the mill and the protest lines, in a redwood named Luna on a ridge above the Stafford area, a young woman named Julia Butterfly Hill was not coming down. Hill had climbed into the ancient redwood in December of 1997, intending to stay for a few weeks in protest against the logging of the surrounding area. She stayed for 738 days, 2 years and change, living on a 6 by 8 foot platform 180 feet above the ground, through rain and wind and winter and the noise of helicopters Pacific Lumber sent to circle the tree. She received food from supporters below. She gave interviews by cell phone. She became the most recognizable face of the entire Headwaters conflict and one of the most visible environmental activists in the world. People who agreed with her called her brave. People who did not called her reckless, self-dramatizing, a distraction from the real policy work. Both things could be true. What was undeniable was the image itself. A single human being, 180 feet in the air, in a tree that had been alive for over 1,000 years, refusing to leave. The image communicated something that no press release and no regulatory filing could communicate, that there were people for whom this forest was worth more than convenience, more than comfort, more than safety. That the stakes, for them, were absolute. In November of 1999, after protracted negotiations, Hill came down. Pacific Lumber agreed to preserve Luna and a small buffer of trees around it. The agreement cost a private donor $50,000 paid to the company. A 1,000-year-old tree and a circle of forest around it, purchased for $50,000 because that was the price the market set. Hill wept when she reached the ground. She had protected one tree. Headwaters had been partly preserved by a government deal struck months earlier, but the logging on the surrounding lands continued. The debt continued. The legal battles continued. And somewhere in the hills, the chainsaws were still running. The question the protest years left behind was not whether the activists were right or wrong. It was a harder question. It was, what does it say about a society when the only way to protect something irreplaceable is to put a human body in front of it? What does it say about the adequacy of every other institution, the regulatory system, the courts, the market, the government, when a young woman has to live in a tree for 2 years to make a point that should have been obvious from the beginning? Those questions had no clean answers in 1999. They still do not. Chapter 13. The state buys a cathedral. Governments do not usually buy forests. They protect them through regulation, through designation, through the slow accumulation of administrative rules that constrain what private owners can do with their land. The public does not typically write a check to a timber company for the right to stop the timber company from cutting its trees. That is not how conservation is supposed to work. But the Pacific Lumber situation had, by the mid-1990s, produced a circumstance that normal regulatory tools could not fully address. The forest was private property. The company had the legal right to cut it. The endangered species protections and the regulatory constraints were real but incomplete, and the company's lawyers were skilled at contesting them. The protests were keeping the story visible, but could not, by themselves, stop a chainsaw. And the debt, the original sin of the whole enterprise, was still there, still accumulating interest, still driving the pace of harvest in ways that no protest and no regulation had managed to slow decisively. So the government decided to buy. The first serious framework for a deal emerged in 1996. State and federal negotiators began talking to Pacific Lumber about purchasing the Headwaters Grove and a surrounding buffer zone. The basic concept was straightforward. The public would pay the company a sum of money in exchange for permanent protection of the core old growth. In return, Pacific Lumber would agree to a habitat conservation plan covering the rest of its roughly 211,000 acres of timberland, a plan that would impose constraints on how the company managed the land going forward in exchange for regulatory certainty. The initial framework put the price at $380 million, a figure that, when it first appeared in news coverage, caused a sharp intake of breath in some quarters. $380 million of public money. To purchase protection for a forest that had already been private land for over a century, that had been endangered not by any public failure, but by a leveraged buyout financed by junk bonds. The money would effectively be paid to the same financial structure that had created the threat in the first place. Whether this was rescue or ransom depended entirely on how you framed the question. The company and its supporters called it a fair transaction, a willing seller, a willing buyer, a negotiated price for exceptional land. Critics called it something closer to extortion, the public being required to pay to recover what private finance had endangered, with no guarantee that the underlying problem, the debt, the harvest pressure, the fundamental mismatch between the company's obligations and its ecological situation, would actually be resolved. The negotiations were not smooth. They dragged across years, through changes in state and federal administrations, through ongoing logging disputes, through protests and lawsuits and failed deadlines. The deal came close to collapsing multiple times. At one point, in the final weeks of negotiation in early 1999, it nearly fell apart entirely over the question of how much timber Pacific Lumber would be permitted to harvest under the Habitat Conservation Plan. The company wanted a higher allowable harvest figure than regulators had offered. Government officials revised their estimate of the sustainable yield upward, from approximately 138 million board feet to roughly 180 million, and that revision, controversial among scientists who questioned whether the higher number was defensible, was what finally made the deal acceptable to the company. On March 1, 1999, the Headwaters Agreement was finalized. The Headwaters Forest Reserve was established. The numbers written into that moment are worth holding all at once. The state and federal governments committed $380 million under the 1996 framework. The final 1999 settlement grew to $480 million. That payment transferred approximately 10,000 acres of land into public ownership. Of those 10,000 acres, the protected Headwaters Forest Reserve ultimately encompassed 7,472 acres of ancient old growth and surrounding habitat. The Habitat Conservation Plan imposed new management rules on the remaining 211,000 acres of Pacific lumber timberland. The protests that produced the political pressure to make this deal possible had run continuously for 13 years, from 1986 to 1999. John Campbell, who had risen to lead Pacific Lumber under Maxim, said of the deal that they were able to preserve Headwaters while giving the company financial stability. He meant financial stability. The company had traded its most symbolically significant asset for cash that would help service its debt. Whether that constituted preservation or liquidation at one remove was a question no one in the room that day wanted to answer too directly. The groves were protected. The ancient trees were safe from the chainsaw. That was real. That mattered. Anyone who has stood in those groves understands that something irreplaceable was kept intact that day, and that without the deal, it might not have been. But the debt remained. The harvest on the surrounding lands continued. The Elk River was already running brown, and the company that had just received $480 million in public money was still, structurally, a leveraged entity trying to cut its way out of a hole that had been dug for it in Houston in 1985. The cathedral had been bought. The institution that had sold it was still in trouble, and the trouble was not finished. Chapter 14: What the Deal Did Not Solve. The ink was barely dry on the Headwaters Agreement when it became clear that the deal, as significant as it was, had not resolved the underlying crisis. It had addressed the most visible symptom. It had not touched the disease. The disease was still the debt. The debt was still enormous. The harvest was still running at rates the land could not indefinitely sustain. And the consequences of 2 decades of accelerated cutting, consequences that do not announce themselves immediately, that move slowly through soil and water, and root systems and stream channels over years and sometimes decades, were beginning to surface in ways that could no longer be attributed to natural variability or bad weather. The Elk River runs through the southern Humboldt County timberlands, through terrain that had been logged hard in the years following the takeover. By the late 1990s, the people who lived downstream were experiencing floods. Not just the ordinary floods of a wet Northern California winter, but floods that carried an unusual amount of debris, unusual amounts of sediment, floods that came faster and receded more slowly than older residents remembered. The hillsides above the river had lost significant forest cover. The root systems that had been holding the soil for centuries were gone in many places. When the rains came, and in Humboldt County they came hard, the soil moved, and the river received it. In 1998, the Elk River was officially listed as sediment impaired under California water quality law. That designation sounds bureaucratic. What it means in practice is that a government agency looked at the data and concluded that the river was receiving more sediment than a healthy aquatic ecosystem could tolerate, that the biological capacity of the river to support fish, invertebrates, and the broader food web was being compromised by the load of material washing in from the surrounding watershed. Residents filed complaints. Some had their homes flooded repeatedly. Some reported that the flooding had grown measurably worse after logging operations pushed into the upper watershed. The company disputed the causal connections. Scientists disagreed about the precise degree to which logging versus natural factors was driving the problem. These disputes had the structure of arguments that could continue indefinitely, and Pacific Lumber's legal team was well practiced at arguing indefinitely. Eventually, watershed-specific discharge rules were developed and imposed on harvest operations in the Elk River drainage. The rules constrained where and how the company could cut in certain areas. The company objected. More legal battles followed. More years passed. The river ran brown through all of it. This is what the Headwaters deal did not and could not solve: the consequences of decisions that had already been made. You can protect a grove of ancient trees. You cannot unlog a hillside that has already been logged. You cannot put the soil back into the slope. You cannot rebuild the root systems that held it. The biological debts of the 1980s and 1990s were still being paid out in sediment and floodwater long after the conservation deal had been signed and celebrated. There was also the question of the 211,000 acres that were not headwaters. The Habitat Conservation Plan was supposed to govern those lands responsibly, but the company was still carrying its enormous debt load. The pressure to cut had not evaporated because the most photogenic portion of the estate was now a reserve. The remaining timberlands were still being managed against a financial background that prioritized cash flow over long-term sustainability, and the regulatory battles over harvest practices on those lands continued to grind through the courts and agencies for years. The activists who had spent a decade or more fighting for Headwaters found themselves, after the 1999 deal, in an uncomfortable position. The victory was real. The grove was protected. But the broader situation, the debt, the harvest pressure, the ongoing degradation of the watershed, had not been resolved by the deal. It had been partially stabilized. And partial stability, for a company still organized around leveraged finance, is not the same as health. The sense that the public had paid nearly $500 million to address a problem that private finance had created and had received in return something far less than a complete solution sat in the background of everything that followed. Not as an argument for having done nothing, the groves were worth saving, and they were saved, but as a reminder that buying your way out of a crisis is not the same as solving it. The crisis, in its financial form, was still unresolved, and it was running out of time. Chapter 15. Bankruptcy and the Scattered Kingdom. In January of 2007, Pacific Lumber Company missed an interest payment, not a small one, $27 million due to its bondholders, not paid. The company filed for Chapter 11, bankruptcy protection. And, with that filing, the last chapter of an institution that had been operating in Humboldt County since 1863 finally began to close. The bankruptcy was not a surprise to anyone who had been watching. The financial structure imposed in 1985 had never been stable in any long-term sense. The debt had been enormous from the beginning, and the mechanisms available to service it, timber harvest, asset sales, the Headwaters payment, had not been sufficient to bring it to a manageable level. The regulatory battles of the late 90s had constrained harvest in ways that made the cash flow problem worse. The flood and sediment litigation added legal costs. The Habitat Conservation Plan imposed obligations that limited flexibility. The company was caught, as it had arguably always been caught since the takeover, between what it owed and what the land could give. The bankruptcy proceedings revealed the full anatomy of the financial wreckage. 200,000 acres of redwood timberland tied up in the case. Noteholders owed $714 million. Marathon Structured Finance Fund owed $160 million. The reorganization plan that eventually emerged used $580 million in cash, drawn from the competing proposals of creditors and acquirers, to take the reorganized companies out of bankruptcy and into new ownership. Mendocino Redwood Company and Marathon emerged as the primary new owners of the timberlands. The mills were restructured, the legal entities were dissolved and reconstituted. And then there was Scotia. The town had existed, in one form or another, since the 1880s, 120-some years of company ownership. The houses, the streets, the water system, the recreation facilities, all of it had been part of the Pacific Lumber Estate. When the bankruptcy reorganization was completed in 2008, Scotia was split off from the timberlands into its own separate entity. The company town became its own company, and then, gradually, that company began doing what no previous owner had ever done. It began selling the houses. 270 homes, most of them built in the cream and brown company style, most of them occupied by families who had been renting from Pacific Lumber for years or decades. They were offered for sale, one by one, to whoever could afford them. The company town was being converted into an ordinary town. The institutional structure that had organized daily life in Scotia for over a century was being dissolved into individual property transactions. For some residents, this was liberation: to own your own house, to have a deed with your name on it, to stop paying rent to the company you worked for. That was something the old system had never offered. For others, especially older residents and those with fewer financial resources, the transition was disorienting and sometimes financially devastating. The low rents that had made Scotia affordable were gone. The new market rate reality was not what they had budgeted for. The cushion that paternalism had provided for all its costs was no longer there. The empire had not been conquered. It had been disassembled. The numbers it left behind are the most honest record of what happened. Founded in 1863, acquired in late 1985 for approximately $900 million, financed with $300 million in bank debt and $450 million in junk bonds. Annual harvest doubled from 175 million to 368 million board feet within 2 years. $480 million in public money paid in 1999 for 10,000 acres of protected forest. 7,472 acres preserved in the Headwaters Forest Reserve. $714 million owed to note holders at the time of bankruptcy. $580 million in cash used to reorganize the company out of Chapter 11. 270 houses sold off, one by one, in the town that had once belonged entirely to the company. And 144 years from founding to bankruptcy filing. The entire arc of an institution compressed into a balance sheet and a court docket. The Headwaters Forest Reserve is still there. The ancient trees are still standing, still adding rings, still pulling fog from the air. You can walk into those groves today and feel the same thing that Greg King felt when he first walked in decades ago, the same overwhelming scale, the same biological depth, the same sense of entering something that does not operate on human time. The mills are quieter now. Some of them are closed. The town of Scotia is a different kind of place than it was. Neither fully the company town it used to be, nor fully the ordinary town it is trying to become. The people who spent their working lives in that mill and that forest are older now, and the ones who are gone have left behind families who are still trying to make sense of what happened to the institution they built their lives inside. The forest that was supposed to pay for the acquisition of the company that owned it turned out, in the end, to have cost everyone involved more than they had bargained for. The trees that were cut to service the debt are gone. The debt is gone too, dissolved in bankruptcy. The people who arranged the debt walked away. The people who lived inside the institution did not have that option. The town is still there. The hills are still there. The river still runs, a little browner than it used to, down to the sea. This was never just a story about redwoods. It was a story about what happens when the logic of debt is applied to a living system, a forest, a town, a way of life that was not designed to survive at that speed. The trees were old enough to know better. The institutions were not. And the fog comes in every morning, just as it always has, and covers the hills above Scotia, and for a few hours the world looks arranged and quiet and permanent, and then the light changes and you can see exactly how much is gone.